that spot, and it slid in like I was sliding it into a pat of warm butter, and it went in. I couldn't feel it, of course, but it went in about a ½ inch, and then...
Humans are undeniably fragile, yet some individuals have an extraordinary ability to survive against overwhelming odds.
And I was right in the water, and I know I'm going to die.
It almost seems like fate plays favorites with those who manage to endure the most impossible situations. From being the only person to survive a volcano to the real Robinson Crusoe, here are 20 incredible stories of people who survived the impossible. Number 20. The sole survivor of a volcanic eruption. Ludger Silberus was a man who survived an unimaginable disaster purely by chance and sheer luck. His story began in the bustling city of Saint-Pierre on the island of Martinique in 1902. The residents of the city lived under the looming presence of Mount Pelée, a volcano that had recently begun to exhibit alarming signs of activity. Despite the growing tremors and smoke, life in Saint-Pierre continued as usual, with the residents unaware of the impending catastrophe. Ludger Silberus, meanwhile, found himself in a dire situation. Following an altercation, he was arrested and thrown into solitary confinement in a small underground cell. Although it must have felt like a nightmare to him at the time, it was this very cell that would ultimately save his life. On May 8, 1902, Mount Pelée erupted with devastating force, unleashing a scorching pyroclastic flow that obliterated everything in its path. Within mere minutes, Saint-Pierre, once home to nearly 30,000 people, was reduced to a fiery wasteland with no apparent survivors. The city had been completely consumed by the eruption. Miraculously, Ludger Silberus, though severely burned, had survived the volcanic onslaught. The thick walls of his prison cell, which had seemed like a punishment just days earlier, protected him from the deadly lava and searing heat that destroyed the city. Despite being imprisoned for a prior altercation, Ludger emerged as the only known survivor of the disaster. It's astounding to consider that out of more than 30,000 people, only one person made it through the catastrophe alive. Number 19. The real-life Robinson Crusoe. You may have heard or read the tale of Robinson Crusoe as a child, a story about a man who is shipwrecked multiple times, but always manages to escape perilous situations. But did you know that this fictional account was inspired by a true story, the story of Alexander Selkirk? The adventure began in 1704 when Selkirk, a Scottish sailor, arrived at the Cinque Ports. At that time, he became convinced that the ship he was on would not stay afloat. Taking matters into his own hands, Selkirk made the bold decision to deliberately strand himself on the uninhabited Juan Fernandez Islands off the coast of Chile. For 4 years and 4 months, Alexander Selkirk lived in complete isolation on this remote island. With no other human companions, he befriended the wild goats that roamed the land. Selkirk used the resources around him to survive, crafting clothes from goatskins and spending much of his time reading his Bible. Over time, he became an expert hunter and even managed to tame some of the island's feral cats to help control the rat population. In 1709, Selkirk's solitary existence came to an end when he spotted a ship in the distance. Using a high vantage point, he successfully caught the attention of the passing crew and was finally rescued. Upon his return to civilization, Selkirk's remarkable story spread quickly, eventually becoming the inspiration for the novel Robinson Crusoe. Number 18. Surviving the Antarctic continent. In the early 20th century, Antarctica remained one of the last unexplored frontiers on Earth. Sir Douglas Mawson was one of the intrepid explorers who dared to venture into this icy wilderness. In 1912, Mawson led an Australasian Antarctic expedition, which proceeded smoothly until disaster struck during a trek away from their main base. Two of Mawson's fellow explorers, Belgrave Ninnis and Xavier Mertz, met tragic ends, leaving Mawson alone in one of the harshest environments on the planet. To make matters worse, most of their supplies and sled dogs were lost in a fall, leaving Mawson with minimal resources to survive. Now entirely on his own, Mawson faced the daunting task of journeying 100 miles back to base camp with limited rations and gear. He endured extreme isolation, frostbite, and severe hunger. There were moments when Mawson was so exhausted and malnourished that he collapsed in the snow, only to summon the strength to rise and continue. Ingeniously, he crafted makeshift snowshoes from the remnants of their sled to help him navigate the treacherous terrain. Through sheer willpower and determination, Mawson eventually made it back to base camp. However, he arrived just in time to witness his rescue ship leaving the continent. His luck seemed to have run out, but fortunately the ship's crew noticed Mawson's distress signal, and he was rescued in the nick of time. After enduring countless harrowing days in the Antarctic, Mawson finally made it home. Number 17. A death-defying journey. How far would you go to return to your homeland? The story of Yahya Abdi might leave you astonished. Yahya Abdi was a 15-year-old Somali immigrant living in Santa Clara, California. However, his intense homesickness and yearning to reunite with his mother, whom he hadn't seen in years, drove him to take an unimaginable risk. On April 20th, 2014, Abdi scaled the fence at San Jose International Airport. Evading security, he made his way into the wheel well of a Boeing 767 bound for Maui, Hawaii. As the plane took off, Abdi, hidden within the wheel well, faced freezing temperatures, dangerously low oxygen levels, and the extreme dangers associated with being a stowaway. Miraculously, when the plane touched down in Maui 5.5 hours later, Abdi emerged from the wheel well, dazed but very much alive. Medical experts were stunned by his survival. The harsh conditions should have been fatal. Perhaps his overwhelming desire to escape and find his true home pushed him to endure and survive this incredible journey. Number 16. Surviving the Pacific in 1943. In 1943, during World War II, Louis Zamperini and Russell Phillips were flying over the Pacific in their plane, the Green Hornet. However, disaster struck when their plane crashed into the ocean. Instead of a quick rescue, Zamperini and Phillips were left adrift in shark-infested waters, surviving on the open sea for more than a month. For 47 days they floated, battling hunger, thirst, and dehydration, all while facing the ever-present dangers of the war zone. The vastness of the ocean seemed to have no end, and their ordeal appeared hopeless. After weeks of aimlessly drifting, they finally reached land, but their relief was short-lived, as they were captured by the Japanese and subjected to brutal treatment in POW camps. The harsh conditions they faced would have broken most people, but Zamperini and Phillips remained resilient. Despite the horrors they endured, they were grateful to have shared the harrowing journey together. Number 15. A fall from 33,000 feet. In 1972, Vesna Vulovic, a Yugoslav flight attendant, found herself aboard JAT Flight 367, which was traveling from Stockholm to Belgrade. However, the journey took a tragic turn when an explosion caused the plane to disintegrate at an altitude of 33,000 feet. Given the severity of the explosion and the altitude, it seemed impossible for anyone to survive. Yet, against all odds, Vesna did. She plummeted to the ground within a section of the plane's wreckage, which landed on a snow-covered hill. The snow cushioned her fall, softening the impact. When rescue workers arrived at the scene, expecting no survivors, they were astonished to find Vesna alive. She had suffered a fractured skull, 2 broken legs, and 3 broken vertebrae, leaving her temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. Despite the severe injuries, Vesna not only survived the fall, but made a near-complete recovery. Number 14. 5,500 miles away from home. In late 2012, Salvador Alvarenga, a fisherman from El Salvador, embarked on a journey that sounds like something straight out of a survival movie. Salvador set out on a fishing trip off the coast of Mexico with his companion Ezekiel when an unexpected storm hit. The storm left the 2 men stranded in the vast Pacific Ocean with only a small boat and limited supplies. To survive, they caught fish with their hands, collected rainwater for drinking, and even ate sea turtles and birds when they could catch them. Despite their best efforts, the situation was dire, and survival seemed bleak. Tragically, Ezekiel lost his life after a few months, leaving Salvador alone in the vast ocean. But Salvador didn't give up. After more than a year adrift in January 2014, his boat finally washed ashore on a remote atoll in the Marshall Islands, 5,500 miles from where he had started. For perspective, that's like traveling from the United States to Belgium. Salvador was weak, dehydrated, and emaciated, Number 13. 40 days in the Amazon jungle. Could you survive 40 days in the Amazon jungle? Most of us wouldn't stand a chance. Yet against all odds, 3 young siblings managed to do just that. Leslie, who was 13 years old, Selene, aged 9, and Noriel, only 4, became lost in the Amazon after their plane crashed. At first, they relied on the provisions left behind by the wreckage to sustain themselves, but as the food ran out, they were forced to navigate the vast and dangerous Amazon rainforest. Their indigenous background and deep knowledge of the forest played a crucial role in their survival. Experts believe their upbringing equipped them with the essential skills needed to survive in such a challenging environment. While most young children wouldn't be able to fend for themselves in the wild, these siblings used their skills to increase their chances of survival. Against all odds, after 40 grueling days, rescuers found the 3 children, weak but very much alive. Number 12. Falling 2 miles from the sky. One of the most astonishing survival stories belongs to Dr. Julianne Diller, who was once known as Julianne Kupske. In 1971, at just 17 years old, Julianne faced an unimaginable ordeal. She and her mother boarded LANSA Flight 508, departing from Lima and bound for Pucallpa, Peru, hoping to spend Christmas with her father. This flight was a last-minute choice in their effort to reach home in time, a decision that turned out to be tragically wrong. Mid-flight, the plane disintegrated in the sky, and Julianne, still strapped to her seat, plummeted nearly 2 miles to the ground. Miraculously, the dense canopy of trees below cushioned her fall, allowing her to survive. When Julianne regained consciousness, she found herself alone in the vast expanse of the Amazon rainforest. Fortunately, having been raised by German zoologist parents, she was well versed in survival techniques. She drew on the knowledge they had instilled in her about navigating the Amazon wilderness. For 10 agonizing days she endured, surviving on rainwater and whatever scraps of food she could find. Eventually, she stumbled upon a boat and a small shelter. She waited there until she was finally rescued. Although her mother did not survive the crash, Julianne went on to become a respected scientist, returning to the rainforest to continue her parents' legacy. Number 11. Surviving the atomic bombs. The 20th century witnessed many significant events, but few were as profoundly devastating as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Experiencing just one of these bombings would likely be fatal for anyone. However, one man, Tsutomu Yamaguchi, remarkably survived both. In August 1945, Yamaguchi was concluding a business trip to Hiroshima on behalf of his employer, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. On the morning of August 6th, as he prepared to leave the city, a blinding flash filled the sky. This was the moment when Little Boy, the atomic bomb, was dropped on Hiroshima. Although Yamaguchi was approximately 3 kilometers from the epicenter, the blast threw him off his feet and he sustained severe burns. Despite his injuries, Yamaguchi managed to find shelter and receive some medical treatment. After spending a night in the devastated city, he embarked on a difficult journey back to his hometown to reunite with his family. Fatefully, that hometown was Nagasaki. Upon his return to Nagasaki on August 8th, Yamaguchi began to recover and shared the horrific details of Hiroshima with his employer. But on August 9th, tragedy struck once again. Another blinding flash lit up the sky as Fat Man, the second atomic bomb, was dropped on Nagasaki. In an almost unbelievable twist of fate, Yamaguchi had become a double atomic bomb survivor. Fortunately, his family was unharmed by the second bombing, and Yamaguchi went on to live until the age of 93, passing away in 2010. Time for the fancy topic. In a small-town hospital, a man named Thomas, who had been in a coma for 19 years, suddenly woke up. Doctors and family members were shocked and overjoyed by his unexpected recovery. However, their joy quickly turned to unease when Thomas began to speak. The man woke up from a 19-year coma, and what he told disturbed everyone. Thomas recounted vivid and disturbing experiences that he claimed to have had during his coma. He described a dark, twisted world where he said he was trapped, unable to wake up or communicate. According to Thomas, he was not alone in this place. He insisted that there were others, souls of the comatose, who were unable to find peace and wandered aimlessly. His detailed descriptions were so unsettling that hospital staff and his family were left deeply disturbed. Thomas's story has left everyone questioning the boundaries between life and death. What could have caused such intense visions during his coma? And could there be any truth to his terrifying experiences? Let us know in the comments with the hashtag #FancyTopic. Number 10. 500 Days in a Cave. Beatrice Flamini undertook a unique and challenging experiment. She chose to live alone in a cave in Spain for 500 days. Yes, you read that correctly. 230 feet underground. This wasn't just a personal challenge. It was part of a research project with scientists and psychologists monitoring her to study the effects of prolonged isolation and living in a cave environment. Flamini began her subterranean life on November 21, 2021, completely cut off from the outside world. She even instructed her team not to inform her of any major events, even those concerning her family. During her year and a half of silence, Flamini kept herself occupied by reading books, exercising, drawing, painting, and knitting woolly hats. She also experienced auditory hallucinations as her brain began to create sounds to fill the overwhelming silence. After about 2 months, she lost track of time entirely and believed she had been underground for only 160 days when her team finally came to retrieve her. While her achievement isn't officially recognized by Guinness World Records, her team believes that Flamini set a world record for the longest voluntary cave dwelling at 500 days. It's astonishing to think about how she managed to stay sane without any human contact for so long. I know I wouldn't have been able to endure it. Could you imagine agreeing to such an extreme experiment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Number 9. Lost in the Desert. In 1994, Italian police officer Mauro Prosperi took on the daunting challenge of the Marathon des Sables, one of the most grueling foot races on the planet. This extreme marathon stretches over 155 miles across the unforgiving Sahara Desert, where temperatures can soar to a blistering 120 degrees Fahrenheit. However, just a few days into the race, something unexpected occurred. A violent sandstorm swept through, leaving Prosperi disoriented and separated from the rest of the group. He lost his sense of direction completely. As he wandered off the designated path and deeper into the vast Sahara, Mauro faced a brutal fight for survival in the days that followed. His supplies quickly ran out, forcing him to resort to desperate measures, including drinking his own urine and even consuming the blood of bats he found in an abandoned shrine. He left signals and messages in the hope of being rescued, but as days passed and turned into an entire week, rescue seemed less likely. After enduring 9 harrowing days and covering more than 180 miles, Mauro finally encountered a group of nomadic people who saved his life. By the time they found him, he had lost 40 pounds and was teetering on the edge of death. But, against all odds, he survived. Number 8. Hanging on for dear life. The story of Chris Gursky serves as a stark reminder that dream vacations can sometimes take a terrifying turn. Gursky, a tourist looking for adventure, decided to try hang gliding in the breathtaking landscapes of Switzerland. It sounded like the perfect idea until it turned into a nightmare. In a heart-stopping moment, Gursky realized that he wasn't properly secured to the glider. As the glider soared higher into the sky, he found himself clinging to the bar with one hand and gripping the instructor's leg with the other, dangling precariously hundreds of feet above the ground. Gursky's incredible strength and determination to hold on for dear life were the only things that saved him from certain death. For a nerve-wracking 2 minutes and 14 seconds, Chris managed to hang on to the glider. Meanwhile, the instructor, while struggling to control the glider, made repeated attempts to pull Chris to safety, but his compromised position made it extremely difficult. Despite this terrifying ordeal, Chris didn't let the experience deter him. In fact, he chose not to sue the company and even remarked that the instructor, despite the mistake, was a decent guy. Number 7. Sole survivor of an airplane wreck. In 2009, Yemenia Flight 626, carrying 153 passengers, tragically crashed into the Indian Ocean near the Comoros Islands. The initial reports were grim, with the world believing that there were no survivors. However, against all odds, there was one survivor, a 12-year-old girl named Bahia Bakari. After the crash, Bahia found herself adrift in the vast Indian Ocean, clinging to a piece of the wreckage. She spent over 9 hours in the water, surrounded by darkness and the seemingly endless ocean. Miraculously, a passing ship eventually spotted the wreckage and noticed the faint silhouette of Bahia holding on for dear life. She was pulled to safety, exhausted but alive. Her survival in such dire conditions was nothing short of a miracle. Bahia endured exhaustion and dehydration, challenges that most would not have survived, and her rescue remains one of the most incredible survival stories. Number 6. The only Japanese person who survived the Titanic. This story highlights the harsh reality that surviving a disaster doesn't always lead to a life of peace. Imagine surviving one of the most infamous maritime tragedies in history, only to be shunned and shamed upon returning home. This is the tragic tale of Masabumi Hosono. In 1912, Masabumi Hosono, a Japanese civil servant, was on his way back to Japan after completing some official business in Russia. He boarded the Titanic for his return journey, but as we all know, the ship struck an iceberg and began to sink during its maiden voyage. Like many others, Hosono believed he was facing certain death as the unsinkable Titanic began to descend into the icy waters, and with lifeboats in short supply, Hosono managed, through a mix of desperation and luck, to secure a spot on one of the last lifeboats, Lifeboat 10. You might think that surviving such a catastrophic event would have earned Hosono a hero's welcome back in Japan, but this was not the case. Upon his return, instead of receiving accolades, Hosono was met with widespread shame and ostracism. Many in Japan branded him a coward for not going down with the ship. Newspapers criticized him for not giving up his seat for a woman or child. The irony is that there were men of various nationalities aboard that very lifeboat, yet Hosono lost his job and endured public ridicule. The narrative was so ingrained that even decades later, when his story was taught in schools, the focus was on his supposed cowardice rather than on his miraculous survival. Number 5. RMS Titanic survivor. Here's another Titanic survivor whose story, unlike that of Masabumi Hosono, was met with admiration rather than scorn. Richard Dick Williams was among the many who boarded the Titanic with dreams of starting a new life. His goal was to pursue a career in tennis in New York City. But fate had other plans when the RMS Titanic tragically sank into the icy waters of the Atlantic. In the midst of the chaos, Williams immediately began assisting others, helping them into lifeboats. His selflessness, however, came at a cost. With no other options left, he and his tennis companion, Carl Baer, had to leap into the freezing waters of the Atlantic. Fortunately, both men survived and were eventually rescued by Lifeboat 14. Rather than allowing this near-death experience to shatter his spirit, Williams used it as a turning point in his life. Instead of being haunted by the tragedy, he channeled his energy into his passion for tennis, which became a symbol of hope and resilience for him. In the years that followed, Williams didn't just return to the tennis courts. He excelled, winning multiple U.S. championships and even earning a gold medal at the Olympics. Number 4. Man struck by lightning 7 times. Being struck by lightning is often fatal, leading to paralysis or death. However, one man defied these odds by surviving not just one lightning strike, but 7. Have you ever heard the saying, lightning never strikes the same place twice? Well, Roy C. Sullivan proved to be an exception to this rule. His story began in 1942 when Roy, who was working as a park ranger, was inside a fire lookout tower during a storm. Lightning struck the tower and Roy lost a big toenail but miraculously survived. Fast forward to 1969, and Roy was driving his truck when lightning struck again. This time it burned off his eyebrows and knocked him unconscious. But once again he survived. Just a year later, while standing in his front yard, he was struck by lightning a 3rd time, leaving him with a sore shoulder. In 1972, lightning hit him once more while he was inside a ranger station, setting his hair on fire. Incredibly, Roy was struck again in 1973, 1976, and finally in 1977. After 7 lightning strikes, it's hard to say whether Roy was the luckiest or unluckiest man alive. Number 3. 127 hours. In 2003, Aaron Ralston, an experienced outdoorsman, set out on a solo hike in Blue John Canyon, Utah, unaware that this journey would push him to the very brink of his mental, emotional, and physical limits. While navigating through a narrow slot of the canyon, Ralston accidentally dislodged an 800-pound boulder, which trapped his right forearm against the canyon wall. Alone, with limited supplies and no means of calling for help, he faced a dire situation. Over the course of 5 excruciating days, Ralston tried everything to free himself. He rationed his food and water, even resorting to drinking his own urine when he ran out of water. He attempted to chip away at the boulder and rigged makeshift pulleys to try to move it, but all his efforts were in vain. As the days dragged on, Ralston began recording farewell messages for his family, realizing that his chances of survival were slipping away. With his situation growing increasingly desperate, he made a gut-wrenching decision. Using a blunt pocket knife, Ralston amputated his own forearm in order to free himself from the boulder's grip. After this harrowing ordeal, he rappelled down a 65-foot wall and hiked several miles until he encountered a family who helped him and alerted the authorities. Ralston's story is one of the most extraordinary tales of survival, showcasing an immense will to live that few could ever imagine possessing. Number 2. 60 hours beneath the Atlantic. Typically, being trapped underwater spells immediate doom. The crushing pressure, icy temperatures, and absence of oxygen make survival virtually unthinkable. Yet one man defied these odds, not just for a fleeting moment, but for a staggering 3 days at the ocean's bottom. The Atlantic Ocean, to be precise. In 2013, Harrison O'Keefe boarded the Jascon 4, a tugboat operating off the Nigerian coast. Disaster struck when the vessel capsized. While most of the crew met a tragic fate, Harrison's fortune took a different turn. As the boat descended into the depths, he discovered an air pocket. However, this stroke of luck didn't guarantee safety. The ensuing 60 hours, he endured in pitch darkness, relying solely on this confined bubble of air. Picture yourself in such a scenario, enveloped in darkness, uncertain of how long your limited oxygen will sustain you, and clueless about rescue prospects. Miraculously, after approximately 60 hours submerged, rescuers located Harrison. Against all expectations, he survived nearly 3 full days beneath the Atlantic's surface. Number 1. The man struck by a particle beam. Particle accelerators are sophisticated devices that delve deep into the mysteries of our universe. They emit highly energized streams of particles, probing the very essence of existence. Given their immense power, it's astounding to think anyone could survive direct exposure. Yet, that's precisely what happened. In 1978, Anatoly Bugorsky was immersed in his duties at the Institute for High Energy Physics in Protvino, Russia. What began as an ordinary workday took a dramatic turn. While examining a malfunctioning apparatus, he unknowingly positioned his head directly in the path of a proton beam. One might wonder about the oversight, expecting rigorous safety protocols. Nevertheless, in that fateful moment, he faced a life-threatening situation. Imagine being struck by something exponentially more potent than a standard X-ray machine. Instead of pain, Anatoly perceived an intense burst of light, a flash that remarkably was inside his own brain. Following the incident, his face swelled significantly, resembling severe sunburn. Over time, he experienced partial facial paralysis. While undeniably challenging, this outcome was far better than the fatal alternative. Remarkably, as years went by, Bugorsky not only survived but continued to make meaningful contributions to his field. His dedication to science remained unwavering. How would you have survived in these situations? Let us know in the comments below. See you next time.